What about the spread of Islam? So Islam has, from a historical point of view, enjoyed extensive periods of growth, conquering, and often there is an accusation that Islam was spread by the sword. What do you have to say about this accusation?
Actually, one non-Muslim Western historian said that the claim that Islam spread by the sword is one of the most fantastically or repeated myth about Islam. And let me start even from a very basic thing. Go to the map of the world and see where the majority of Muslims live today. I bet you find the great majority of Muslims today were in countries where there was no fighting, no conquest. Many of our friends sometimes do not realize that the Arab component of Muslims is a minority of perhaps 15% or so of the total Muslim world population, which is, according to recent figures, it's close to 1.6 billion, actually. That's about 23% of the total world population. Many do not realize that the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, with over 200 million, a Muslim country, is a country where there was no conquest. It's a non-Arab country. If you look at Islam in south of the Sahara in Africa, there was no conquest, there was no fighting. I'm excluding only the northern part because it was under the Roman or Byzantine Empire, and I'll come to that issue. You look into the spread of Islam in areas like the Philippines, Malaysia, the Indian subcontinents, except for the one little problem perhaps or conquest that took place during the time of Muhammad bin Qasim in Sindh, which is only one small part of India. But by and large, Islam spread by free acceptance of people. So even from the reality that we find in the world today, it was not the sword really that spread Islam. I refer to a non-Muslim writer by the name of Sir Thomas Arnold, A-R-N-O-L-D. It says Preaching of Islam, where he discusses the spread of Islam in the archipelago, in Africa, in Asia, and other places in the world, and he concludes basically that yes, there have been some deviation. I said that some Muslims deviate, yeah, no problem. But he says by and large, there are two major factors for the spread of Islam. One, through trade, the merchants. Secondly, through Sufis, the mystics who spread the word of love and serving of humanity, just like merchants traveling and sometimes settling in some places. And when people saw in them some good models of Islam, they were attracted to Islam, and that's how it spread. Thirdly, if Islam were spread by the sword, then what explained the fact that Islam continued to spread even after Muslims were defeated militarily, after there were attempts even to wipe out Islam from the face of the earth, whether during the Crusades or during the Tatars' ransacking of Baghdad, or the defeat of Muslims in Spain and Inquisition and killing that took place. How come Islam continued to spread? Historically, that might be surprising to some. Islam spread factually much faster during the periods of peace rather than the period of war. Beginning from the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, until today, it spread at the time of peace, even when Muslims are defeated. More so than the case of war. You know why? Because when there is war and people are placing themselves in one camp or the other, there is hostility, there is lack of communication, there is distortion of communication, as we see, for example, today. But when there is peace, where people can communicate freely with one another, even though they have differing beliefs, it is when people discover the nature and message of Islam and voluntarily accepted it. That's a historical and known fact. If indeed the sword is responsible for the spread of Islam, where is the sword today when Muslims are in a much weaker political and military situation than ever, when in fact some are even occupied by foreign forces or dominated by other powers? And yet still Islam continued to spread. What explained the spread of Islam in the middle of Europe, in North America, voluntarily by people discovering its message, if the sword had anything to do with this, with all the bad image even, and distorted image that we see, or projection of Islam in the media? It is a totally false thing. Having said that much, I must say that, having said it, I'm not necessarily saying that every act of fighting or spread of Muslim in the world using armies is totally justified from the Sharia point of view, from the Islamic law point of view. During the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the period immediately after him, the rightly guided caliphs, there were good justification for that, because as mentioned earlier, preemptive strike against a gathering, an imminent attack on Muslim or danger in a world where you don't have a United Nations, you don't have any international bodies, was an absolute necessity given the context of that time to defend yourself and actually go and conquer those who are preparing to attack you. The clearest example of this is what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sanctioned, which is not invasion or anything of that nature. When he heard of an army by the Byzantines, people who claim to be Christian, but of course it wasn't a Christian act, were gathering already a huge army in Tabuk, which is now in the northern west part of Saudi Arabia. What were they gathering for? They showed in their words and action before, like killing memorizers of the Quran, that they were very hostile to anyone who challenged their absolute rule. They knew that Islam teaches equality and justice, and they were afraid that the countries and individuals that enslaved will turn against them. So did the Persian rulers, who actually ordered, one of the emperors ordered his local governor in Yemen to go and bring him the head of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And that's not an empty threat. You cannot go and complain to United Nations or Security Council. Muslims had to protect themselves. So when this hostility translated into actual aggression or preparation for aggression, Muslims were more than justified actually to thwart that. They were not fighting to force people to become Muslim. This is a myth. They were fighting to overthrow the tyrannical powers that were actually conspiring against the Muslim community and liberate people. Liberate? Look at Thomas Arnold, who was actually a Christian missionary in India, so cannot be accused of being biased toward Islam or Muslims. When he said two things about, for example, the entry of Islam in Egypt, that was basically a Christian country before, Copt, Eastern Orthodox Church. Undeniably, he said the Egyptians were supporting and helping the Arab army because they felt that they will be liberated from the tyranny of the Byzantine rulers who were actually exploiting the country and mistreating the people and overtaxing them, because they heard about the justice and liberation of Muslims. Thomas Arnold, specifically, in one place he said something that shocked me and might shock some of you. He says, while admitting, as I do, there may have been periods, human beings are not perfect, periods of course of deviations, but he said by and large, the Christian Copts in Egypt lived under Muslim rule for a long period of time, this is just a paraphrasing, for a long period of time, complaining of nothing but, you know what he says? Complaining of nothing except the corruption of their own church. This is not my word. A Christian missionary admitting this. So one has to put things really in its proper perspective. If somebody invaded just to in pursuit of empire building, that's not Islamic. You're not allowed to invade even to spread Islam. Because the text of the Quran in chapter 60, verse 8, the key one that we referred to earlier, says that if people are not fighting you, initiating aggression against you, or oppressing you, you deal with them in justice and compassion. And it is neither justice nor compassion to invade, simply say, I spread Islam. Islam doesn't spread by the sword. It is a big myth. Islam cannot spread except by conviction. If Islam spread by the sword, Muslim ruled in India, and they had great power for hundreds of years, yet today still, the majority are Hindus. How come? If they really were applying that maxim or this notion that you spread Islam by force or because of your political power, they could have easily converted people by force. No, a person converted by force is easily to revert back to their own religion. Muslim ruled in Spain also for centuries, yet they remain minority. Actually, it's an interesting notice historically. There have been some studies conducted on this, that even in countries ruled by Muslims, the Muslims remained minority for a long period of time, sometimes centuries, remained as minority, which means that people had their autonomy. Muslims were like a common a link that constituted a commonwealth, broader commonwealth of Muslims at that time. I hate to call it empire, but I say commonwealth, perhaps. So I think we need to be more honest, more open, more objective. Yes, admitting the wrong, but in the meantime also not whitewashing the long tradition of tolerance and living with each other and contributing immensely to human civilization.